you to quickly describe the goal of the webinar series.
Thank you, Ambika. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. As you know, the Med Safety Exchange webinar series is the product of a couple of years white paper project on medication instance data sources and their gaps, supported by CPSI and collaborated with CPSI. The findings of the white paper project were further examined by a national expert advisory panel that recommended a pilot to create a more effective sharing and learning platform. Taking a page from the National Health Services of UK, which has implemented a very successful monthly webinar program across the United Kingdom, we hope this Med Safety Exchange webinar series will provide another opportunity for sharing and learning in the healthcare system in Canada. The overall goal of the webinar series is to learn from the individuals and organizations on their discovery and findings of medication safety concerns, as well as sharing their strategies to address these issues. I would like to thank CPSI for their continuing support and to thank all the other stakeholders for giving our team the guidance, assistance, contribution, and participation. Without further undue delay, I'm passing that back to Ambika.
Hey, thank you, David. So I'm just going to do a quick overview. Every webinar will have roughly the same structure, but with different content. So for this webinar, we'll have 2 med incident analyses, a med review involving clozapine and enteral potassium chloride in pediatrics. And this will be followed by the observatory with a med safety update. And then we'll finish up with the discussion period where we read out your comments and allow the speakers to elaborate. So anonymity is a choice for all those involved in the webinar. So only introduce speakers briefly, and they can choose to share as much or as little about themselves or their practice site. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker presenting a med incident analysis of a case involving clozapine being inadvertently missed during a med review.
So thank you, Ambika, and my name is Diana Ryman, and I work at Grey Bruce Health Services. I may say the words GBHS along the way, our acronym. And currently, I'm the Director of Quality and Safety here, but you'll know formerly I was the Director of Pharmacy at this corporation, and I'm a passionate supporter of medication safety and the great work that ISMP does in sharing and learning from medication incidents. I'm really honored to be able to share the interesting case with you, which has led to some improvements on our hospital, and hopefully by sharing the learnings and actions we've taken can help others to address similar risks in their systems and prevent this issue from happening to one of their patients. So just a little bit about Grey Bruce Health Services. We're a 6-site hospital corporation in rural southwestern Ontario. We have a catchment population of about 165,000, but in the summertime, and perhaps on beautiful days like today, we do attract a lot of visitors to our area, over 2 million a year, to enjoy our natural beauties of the area. We have our main hospital in Owen Sound is a Schedule I mental health facility, and we offer comprehensive pharmacy services both centrally and remotely. We have a unit dose drug distribution, automated dispensing units, IV admixture. We run a retail pharmacy accredited. We have an electronic MAR, and we have, for our medication reconciliation process, we use a hybridized system where pharmacy, nursing, and physicians all play an integral role in our systems. So the case I'm sharing with you today is a story about a man who suffers from schizophrenia that presented to one of our hospitals, Hospital A, which is Owen Sound. The story is really a testament to the success of the drug clozapine. This patient had been on clozapine since 1995 and had been successfully controlled in the community without an inpatient admission since 2008, which just so happens to be just about the time we started capturing our electronic medication reconciliation history on our computer system. His clozapine prescriptions are actually being filled by a local hospital pharmacy, and if you work in Ontario, you know that clozapine is handled by all different dispensing systems, but sometimes it goes below the radar of some of our more traditional retail pharmacies. And so what started the incident in question is the patient presented to our hospital emergency department to see one of our local surgeon because he was having a health issue with one of his toes. So it was determined that he needed to be admitted to the hospital, so we start our admission medication reconciliation process. So the nurses or a pharmacy technician who work in the emergency department will start to gather the patient's best possible medication history, and we do this electronically. And for this particular patient, the staff on the day called up the med list on the system and reviewed it, but did not make any updates to it. And so we have our first gap that occurred in our processes. What happens next with our MedRec process is this list is printed, and it's supposed to be used as the patient's admission orders. We have a lovely best possible medication printed list that has the ability to be turned into admission orders. But this patient was being cared for by a surgical resident who's not familiar with our BPMH process, and instead of using our order sheet, they actually hand wrote the patient's admission orders, which caused to further gap and omitted the clozapine on admission. So once our BPMH is used for admitted patients, we have a pharmacy technician or a nurse complete reconciliation on that BPMH within 24 hours of admission. In this case, it was done by a pharmacy technician, and a gap 3 occurred because at this time the reconciliation also missed clozapine during that reconciliation process. In fact, the admission wasn't caught until day 6 of the patient's admission, when this patient happened to run out of another one of his home medications, and so a pharmacist was consulted to come look at the patient's profile to suggest something else as an alternative. And the pharmacist who was called to review just happened to be the psychiatric pharmacist, clinical pharmacist, and knew the patient well and identified the admission. So this pharmacist was then able to take steps to reintroduce the medication safely and begin tapering up the dose, because at that time the patient had been without this medication for longer than 72 hours. So after about a week, the patient was seeming to do very well, and his surgical care was completed. And so our surgeon asked to transfer this patient back to the hospital closer to home, because the psychiatrist wanted to continue to taper that dose up gradually and safely. And so the psychiatrist and the pharmacist carefully created a dose escalation plan and shared that with the referring hospital, and the patient was transferred to their home hospital. So the family physician in the home hospital saw that the patient was still continuing to do well and didn't feel that they needed to continue that medication tapering in the hospital, and decided to discharge the patient after 2 weeks of admission. Even though the psychiatrist had said that probably wasn't a good idea, they did discharge the patient home with instructions on how to taper up. And here's where, unfortunately, we have a significant outcome that occurs, and it's a very difficult part of our story, because somewhere between when the initial clozapine levels were getting to be washed out and our reintroduced clozapine levels may not have been therapeutic yet, the patient experienced decompensation and had a violent incident involving his primary caregiver. And this necessitated readmission to the mental health unit, and unfortunately, because of this admission, the patient required over 3 months of hospital stay to get him to a spot where he could be stabilized to be discharged. And so what a significant impact this seemingly small admission of medication had on this patient, our healthcare system, and really shows the incredible value of what a specific tight medication reconciliation system can do for our hospital systems. One when an incident of this nature occurs at our hospital, we treat it as a critical incident, and those of you that are practicing in Ontario know that there's some legislation that helps guide our quality work around this. And so what we do is we bring together a multidisciplinary team, and in this case it consisted of pharmacy, nursing, mental health, and patient safety to review the details and start strategizing improvements. We also interviewed, part of this process, we interviewed patients and families to gain further insights on what occurred from their perspective. And in this case, the patient wasn't well enough to participate, but we did engage the patient's mother to get her thoughts and feelings on what improvements could be made. So the team worked on that, developed an action plan, and then this is shared with both our quality committee and our board of directors quality committee. And we did also share a copy of that with the patient's mother. So during our review, we put together a timeline of what occurred. And so you can see on day one, we identified we have 2 gaps in our medication reconciliation process, and a third one on day 2. By day 6, we had recognized the issue, leading up to day 7 transfer, and then day 14 discharge, followed by coming back in within 3 weeks of the initial presentation. So when we have the process mapped out, we stop and we identify the gaps, and then we move on to identifying contributing factors. In addition to the MedRep gaps, what we recognized early on, we saw that due to the unique nature that clozapine is funded and dispensed in Ontario, we recognize it is often dispensed outside of traditional retail pharmacies and therefore doesn't appear on the pharmacy and provincial drug database lists that we often use during our MedRec processes. Another contributing factor we found when speaking with the nursing staff is that we heard there was great trust in the pharmacy technicians who complete the MedRec process, as they are seen as the experts. We believe this introduced some biases in the nursing department because they would rarely question or review the work that the technician completes, and that would decrease the chances of us ever catching this through nursing double check. Our MedRec process requires that staff verify 2 sources of information when compiling the medication history. One should always be the patient interview and patient history. However, when we talked to our pharmacy technician in this case, we heard that they aren't always comfortable dealing with patients with mental health disorders and don't always interview them. If this patient would have been interviewed or the caregiver, they both would have clearly reported they were on clozapine since they were well aware of this and had been on it for many, many years. So having identified the gaps and the contributing factors, we set out to make our system improvements. And first of all, we stepped back to look at our MedRec process to do what we could to add to it. We got lucky here because we were just doing a refresh of some of our work to get ready for accreditation, and we're doing some training and with our nursing staff, and so we added some emphasis on the use of 2 sources, review with the patient, and updating the meds list on the computer, and we're able to do some timely education so that people would be aware of the impact of not doing these important steps. We also worked with our mental health team to offer training to our pharmacy technicians to help decrease the stigma associated with mental health patients, and that was well received. We wanted to particularly focus on the drug clozapine because we felt that the way that it's distributed here in Ontario and maybe other places in Canada did have an impact on the ability to provide safe clozapine use. So we worked with our computer system here, and we created a rule in our pharmacy information system which will fire an alert to pharmacy staff if a patient has clozapine listed on their home meds list, which is our computerized list. It's a running list that we keep of patients and their medication history. So if it's on their medication history list, but we don't have an admission order for it, the pharmacist will actually get an alert to note that there's been an omission on the admission medication orders. Beyond that, though, our Safe Medications Practice Committee also felt strongly that this incident showed that clozapine should really be classified as a high alert medication. And so our Safe Meds Practice team took steps to add this to our existing policy and list so that the safeguards that we attach to other high alert meds would also apply to clozapine, and then we would know to treat this drug as particular importance. One of the things we also always do is we want to know that if the changes we made really do have the impact that we're hoping, and so we always trying to look at monitoring and evaluate these changes and whether they get to the improvements we want. And so I can share with you that this patient had to have 2 other readmissions for surgical intervention, and we had no gaps occur in his medication therapy, which was something that caused us it was helpful for us to know that this was a change. So we really want to hope that you would take our work, and we believe that we've been able to sustain the improvements here, and hopefully this will help others address a risk that may be inherent in your systems, and uncover these and address them before it affects one of your patients. So I thank you for letting us share this work with you today.
Great. Thank you, Diana. It was a very interesting case, thorough analysis into the contributing factors. I know when I first read the case, I realized the limitations of some of the commonly used sources for a med review, especially for hospital-sourced medications like clozapine. And of course, the value of a patient interview to fill those gaps, and that can be in every care setting, that's true. So if anyone has questions or comments, I see that we already have some coming through. Or perhaps even additional recommendations based on your own experience, please type them into that comments box or the questions box, and we'll read through them at the end of the presentations when we do our discussion period. So it is my pleasure to introduce the second speaker, or rather speakers, presenting a med incident analysis of a case involving enteral potassium chloride in pediatrics.
Okay, thank you so very much for allowing us to present with you today. So we are just going to jump right into our case. So just a little bit of background of where we are. So we practice in a tertiary care facility in Saskatchewan. We have pediatric services within the tertiary care facility. We have 42 general peds and medicine beds. We have 9 PICU beds, 38 NICU beds, and a maternal child ward. And this incident occurred on our acute care pediatrics ward. So a background about the case, this is a 13-month-old male who was admitted with diarrhea, vomiting, and otitis media. The diagnosis initially was gastroenteritis versus feeding intolerance. He is a complex little guy who we know very well, who's been on our ward quite a few times up until this point and continues to come quite a bit. He has congenital heart disease. He has tetralogy of Fallot. It has been primarily repaired. He does have some congestive heart failure, and he's on diuretics because of that. He has 22q11 deletion. It's DiGeorge syndrome that he has. He has G-tube feeds, and in his feeds at home, he has supplemental KCl due to the diuretics that he is on. So when he came in this time, he was admitted, and his feeds were ordered as per home. So that was a progesterone 30 with Duacal at 35 cc's per hour via his J-tube, and 4 milliequivalents of KCl per 100 of feeds, and the feeds run over 20 hours. So that was the first order at admission in the evening, and that was what he's on at home. The next day, it was specified a little bit more clearly by the second prescriber, so progesterone and Duacal, and the way he's given his feeds at home is not KCl, it's given by no salt, which is potassium, but it's a different name for it. So it was written in as no salt. It was entered into the computer as salt. So when this comes up and you have to send the order to the kitchen to make the formula, it comes up as you have to type it in. So there's no drop-down menu, so salt was entered. Okay. So he actually ended up getting his feeds at this point without the potassium in them. The next day, due to we were monitoring his electrolytes quite closely, and his potassium was up, so the KCL was held to his feeds and reordered, again with no potassium. During this time, what happened was he, at one point, when going back through the MAR, that initial order of the feeds with the 4 milliequivalents of KCL was reviewed, and at one point the potassium was added back because they thought it was supposed to be added back, so it was added back for a couple of doses. And then his potassium had dropped, and so he was going to be added more potassium to his feeds because he was supposed to be getting none. It was supposed to be written as 2 milliequivalents of KCL per 100 mils of feed, which is quite a normal way for us to do things up until this point, but instead it was written as 20 milliequivalents of KCL per 100 mils per feed. This is a tenfold prescribing error, and this is, when discussed with the prescriber, they were thinking in liters, because when we order potassium in IV fluids, we order 20 milliequivalents per liter of fluid. So with this, the child's potassium went up significantly. It went up to 9.2. He was quite unwell, and he required transfer to the PICU. This incident was discussed with the family immediately by the healthcare team that was providing care, and he was transferred on to PICU for further management.
So in our case review, we had it reviewed by our Pediatric Quality Review Committee using a structured approach. On there, you can see the 5 points that we follow on the slide. Navigating here. We identified that there were four contributing factors that led to this incident. First of all, that we had multiple prescribers from different disciplines involved at each time as things were clarified, changed, reordered. There was a lack of recognition on the initial order that no salt product is actually potassium chloride. As you heard in the case, it turned out it was entered wrong into the computers anyhow when he got salt, which would be table salt sodium chloride. But the potential was that he would have received the KCL liquid from pharmacy as well as this KCL from the no salt product. There was also the prescribing error that was just mentioned, where 20 milliequivalents was ordered rather than 2 milliequivalents. The final contributing factor came from pharmacy, where we dispensed the liquid KCL for enteral administration in a commercial container of 20 milliequivalents per 15 milliliters. On the computerized MAR, we would only enter KCL to enteral feeds, check physician's order for latest dose. We don't put a specific dose in there all the time. On there, that is changing to be more reliable. But also, in many cases, the pharmacist is not aware of the total volume of feeds. All we see is add 4 milliequivalents of KCL per 100 mils of feed, and we don't know how much they're being fed. So there's no way for our pharmacist to do a calculation to figure out, oh, he's getting X number of mils of feed in a day, and we know the kid's weight, so that how much K is that, and does that make sense? So that was a gap that we identified. Also, from the nursing perspective, pharmacy dispensed this 20 milliequivalents. It matched the order. So therefore, they said, okay, pharmacy sent that. That's what MAR says. We'll put the 20 milliequivalents in. And it's not a routine practice at our institution, either for IV potassium chloride or the enteral, to calculate the actual number of milliequivalents per kilogram per day, which is interesting, and ISMP has spoken about that in the past on some of their newsletters. We did a further assessment by that quality review committee, also noting that similar incidents have occurred with sodium chloride enterally. And coming from the group in their assessment that for treatment of low potassium, not just supplementing in a feed because there's not enough K in the initial formula, it's that ordering of KCL or sodium chloride as milliequivalents per 100 mils of feeds is imprecise. Because of what I just mentioned, we may not know the actual dose of KCL received if the child throws up, if the feed stopped, if it's changed, or the prescriber may change the dose if the expected change or response in the serum electrolytes is not observed. So not knowing that there might be multiple sources for this electrolyte. Further, the review committee said IV potassium is considered a high alert medication in our institution, as in most. However, we also felt that enteral potassium should be on that high alert list as well because it's equally dangerous. And that the addition of KCl or sodium chloride as a food supplement is an unsafe practice in infants and children for the purpose of treating a low serum electrolyte concentration. They went on to make some recommendations that for all pediatric patients, orders for electrolytes and minerals, so that would include the calcium magnesium, needed to be ordered like any other drug with a dosing frequency and route of administration, and that the total dosage per kilogram per day needs to be indicated, as you see on the screen with an example. Orders written as per volume of feed will not be accepted. The ordered dose may be added to the feed immediately prior to the administration to avoid GI irritation. As most of our audience is aware, KCl can be quite upsetting to the gastrointestinal system. We involve the family.
Okay, so following up after a critical incident is often difficult. In our region, we have a safety reporting system that, based on the error, the incident is then elevated to the appropriate level of administration. Unfortunately, due to the timing of this event, that it was over Christmas, standard procedures for notifying the family and follow-up did not occur in a timely fashion. This may have contributed to the family in having a loss of trust in our system, and it has taken time and transparency to regain that trust. As a system, we look at disclosure following this event so that all disciplines knew their role. This included discussing disclosure at RN education days, where we spoke to staff about what to do if a safety event happened, how to disclose the event, and who to turn to if they needed support. We ensured physicians knew their role, and we re-looked at the standard work in place for administration. After the incident, we reviewed, we met with the family as a multidisciplinary team of pediatricians, intensivists, pharmacists, managers, and social work to discuss the case openly with the family. This included both our findings and our recommendations. We then gave the family an opportunity to ask questions in a safe environment. We've asked the family if they could share with you how they felt during this whole experience. The letter that was provided from the family is very powerful, and I have an opportunity to share some of it with you. Being a parent is not an easy job. Being a parent of a medically complex child is even harder. Shortly after his first birthday, again, we ran into some issues. And nearing Christmas, we were worried that we would not be home altogether for the holidays. But he began showing improvement, and it was looking like we would be home for Christmas, and his big sister was even more excited that she could help her baby brother open his presents. Unfortunately, then the medication error was made. I wish I could sit and tell you in person the anxiety and worry we felt during that time, but just words would not suffice. To now understand how this incident and flaw exists in our policies is gut-wrenching. Yes, human error happens, but the system failed not only my son, but the nurse on duty that night, and all the medical personnel involved. Fortunately, our son has come out okay, but that does not give us our Christmas back. It does not give us those sleepless nights back, and it certainly does not take away the apprehension we now feel every time our son is given a new medication or something is added to his feed. I applaud all the swift work that the Saskatoon Health Region has done to fix this defective way of ordering potassium, and we can only hope that everyone else follows suit.
So what were the outcomes from our review, our involvement of the family? As I mentioned earlier, there will be a change in ordering of potassium chloride and sodium chloride adopted on the pediatrics ward in PICU, and that has occurred. NICU is pending just because summertime and trying to get new things in. Working with several disciplines, we've also created a tip sheet for healthcare providers that includes how to order and administration instructions to help guide the nurse and eventually the family in how to do this. We still have some work in progress, which is that's true in any incident. We have some concerns about the osmolarity of the liquid KCl solution. It's quite high, and some of our health professionals are concerned that if we don't dilute it in large volumes of feed, that it'll cause a problem. The literature indicates that really isn't as big a problem in young pediatric patients as we may think, but it's something we're still working through. to come to consensus. Our ambulatory care patients, those that are already out in their home that may be getting these non-pharmaceutical forms of sodium and potassium, will be transitioned as they come in with follow-up visits. Finally, we need to follow up to ensure that we have compliance. So we're working on getting our list of metrics. What are we going to measure that, yes, we know it now, but it's 6 months and a year from now that we're following it? And as the primary pediatric tertiary care facility, that we need to share our findings and approaches and partner with all of the parts of our province that provide care to children.
Great. Thank you, Blair and team, for that interesting case and detailed recommendations. This case shows how easy it is to have electrolytes from medication sources, dietary sources, and the importance of very clear prescribing and documentation. Again, a reminder to participants to post your questions, comments, or additional recommendations in the comments box for discussion later in the webinar. We'll now get into the observatory for some quick med safety updates. First up is a brief look at a couple med safety articles by Dr. Michael Hamilton from ISMP Canada.
Thanks, Ambika, and I think the observatory is just a really nice way for some of the organizations involved in patient safety and medication safety to give some of their perspective, to tell a bit about what they're working on. And I'm pleased to share a couple of articles that we've come across from the literature that have a fair amount to do with medication safety. So the first article I'd like to talk about here is from Farah, which is he was a researcher in Australia. And really, the title of this is Systematic Review of Prevalence of Medication Errors Resulting in Hospitalization and Death of Nursing Home Residents. And this really looked at the prevalence of medication errors leading to hospitalization and death and serious outcomes in nursing home residences and the factors associated with the risk of death and hospitalization. And I think this study is important because long-term care is a really critical area that doesn't always receive the attention that it deserves, particularly with respect to patient safety. And in this survey, the authors identified over 2,500 studies about medication harm in long-term care, of which really only 11 met the full inclusion criteria. And I think this speaks to the heterogeneity of the data that we collect on medication errors in general, but really in long-term care in particular. I think that in this paper, the demographic findings were in line with typical nursing home residents, meaning, typically female, age 75 and older, on multiple medications. Approximately half of the residents had dementia, cognitive impairment, and a significant number of comorbidities and marked to severe functional impairment. And the review showed that medication errors were common, but really quite variable, and depending on their source of data. So anywhere from 16 to 27% of residents were affected by all types of medication error, and with a high proportion of those, 13 to 31, affected by transfer-related medication errors. Again, sort of speaking to transitions of care being a very vulnerable time in patient safety. About 75% of patients were prescribed at least one potentially inappropriate medication. And it was interesting to note that serious errors or serious effects of medication errors were, somewhat surprisingly low. And this may be that the medication errors resulting in serious outcomes are really infrequent, or my suspicion is they're probably underreported because the patients experiencing them may be referred to hospital and it may be difficult to get the details. And I think it was telling, and one of the authors suggested that, in quotes, death is not an unexpected outcome in this population, so medication errors may happen unnoticed, close quote. Severe outcomes were highly more likely, however, with errors of a repetitive nature, again with errors in transition, with wrong drug, wrong individual errors, and also prescribing errors. And limitations to this review included the large number of studies not included and certainly the variability in methods of collecting data, and really, again, which limits a lot of our data, is the inability to calculate a true prevalence. And I think this systematic review adds to the body of literature around medication safety in long-term care and really points out the difficulties in getting medication error data, particularly from long-term care populations, and really highlights the need for further look. Our second study I'd just like to talk about is called Systematic Review of Prevalence, is the medication safety in 2 intensive care units of a community teaching hospital after electronic health record implementation. And the aim of this study was to assess the impact of the EHR implementation on medication safety in the 2 intensive care units under study. And this study was done a bit of time ago, and it's really based on older data, but it's still really one of the rare prospectively planned pre- and post-studies out there about medication errors in technology implementation. So the authors identified 2,074 events pre-implementation of the electronic health record, which did include computerized physician order entry, and 1,989 events afterwards, for a total of 4,063 medication errors. And as you might suspect, there was a number of types of errors that decreased, such as transcription errors, dispensing errors, certain types of errors during ordering, in particular things with omitted information, certainly abbreviations, illegible orders, and failure to renew, and some specifically late administration of drug-type errors. There were also types of errors that increased after implementation. Specifically, these were wrong drug, wrong start time or stop time, duplicate orders, orders with inappropriate or wrong information, and certainly, again, some errors during administration, like omitted administrations, increased. And therefore, electronic health records, CPOE, as with many potential interventions, can improve certain aspects of medication safety and impact other aspects, and it's really important, I think, to conduct prospective risk analyses before implementation and really try and anticipate all the potential impacts, both positive and negative. And to assist with this, the authors have provided an extensive table of contributing mechanisms to error and potential interventions, which I think is applicable to a wide variety of technologies. And I think this article in particular is worth a read if you or your organization is contemplating introducing a new technology.
Great. Thank you for that update, Mike. Both articles do give us a lot to think about. Next up, we have a quick update from Health Canada providing some background on a regulatory warning that impacts med safety.
Work with a group of we call themselves patient safety specialists. They're all healthcare professionals, and in our own way, Health Canada is trying to contribute to the management and prevention of medication incidents, but we have to work within the context of what we can achieve, and so we focus on medication incidents that are influenced by a product manufacturer's name, label, or package, because some of these have led, at least under real-world conditions, have led to some medication incidents. And so we'd like to share an example of that with you. So the example we wanted to focus on was with regard to a drug called Eligard. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this drug. It's leuprolide. It's actually an extended release formulation of leuprolide acetate. It's used for the palliative treatment of prostate cancer. And just as a quick introduction, it's available in 4 different extended release formulations, but they range from 1 month to 6 months. So if an error occurs, it could, and the patient doesn't get the medication correctly, it could have an impact that's quite critical. So Health Canada had received reports of handling errors with this particular product, and the errors involved either incorrect reconstitution or incorrect route of administration, which in both situations could compromise the clinical efficacy of the drug. So focusing on the incorrect reconstitution first, we had some reports where the product had been described inadequate mixing of the product. If some of you are not familiar with this product, it comes as two separate pre-filled syringes. One syringe has the leuprolide acetate powder, and the other syringe contains the Atrogel delivery system, which confers the extended release properties to this particular product. And it's fairly complex how they have to be prepared, and in some cases, the two syringes have to be fitted together, and then there's a back and forth movement to make sure that the product is well mixed, and shaking itself is just not enough. So that was one situation. There was another situation where the medication error involved the administration of the leuprolide being reconstituted with a diluent other than the Atrogel delivery system. So perhaps it was saline or water. I don't have the details in front of me right now. I think it was saline. So in this instance, we're really kind of using an immediate release type of leuprolide, if you wish, and so because it has an elimination half-life of only 3.6 hours, if it's not reconstituted with the Atrogel delivery system, its properties as a sustained release product were not there, and so its intended efficacy period was compromised. And so if this was a 1 or 4 month product, then it really would be a situation where the testosterone levels were inadequate. The other situation was where there was an incorrect route of administration. The product monograph for Eligard has approved this product for subcutaneous use, but in one of the reports that Health Canada received, the product was administered intramuscularly. There was no information in the product monograph to say how administering a product that was intended for sub-Q, once administered IM, what its efficacy and clinical outcomes might be. And perhaps one of the reasons that it had been administered IM instead of its intended sub-Q is that most of the other leuprolide acetate extended release products are administered IM, so that could have been a potential source of confusion. So what can Health Canada do in situations like this? Because it deals with, in this particular example, deals mostly with the labeling characteristics of the product. We worked very closely with the manufacturer to try to enhance the reconstitution instructions that are currently in the product monograph and also in their educational materials that they provide to healthcare professionals. We also asked the manufacturer to add a statement in the Canadian product monograph that would highlight the fact that if the product is not reconstituted properly or not administered by the intended route, that this could actually lead to a lack of clinical efficacy. That information was not previously in the monograph. As part of our responsibility, we also thought it was important to communicate to healthcare professionals. In this case, we decided to publish it in the monthly newsletter that Health Canada uses to reach out to healthcare professionals about safety information. We published in the Health Product InfoWatch, and that is available online, but we also do an active dissemination to drug information centers across the country, to some of the licensing and voluntary associations. So we did a fairly large dissemination route, and so that kind of gives you an example of where the labeling can, when Health Canada approves a product with its name and label and package, sometimes things change in the real world situation, and here we learn that we have to go back and try to improve the information that's available to prevent any further medication incidents with the product. Thank you for the opportunity to share this with the group.
Yeah, thank you, Pat, for that Health Canada update. We'll now have a CPSI update on their alerts and other med safety initiatives.
Thank you, Ambika. On behalf of the Canadian Patient Safety Institute, I'd like to thank all our attendees here today, as well as our partners, and to ISMP Canada for their leadership in getting this first webinar of the series up and running. And we'll look forward to reconnecting with everyone moving forward. My name is Steve Rutledge. I'm an improvement lead with CPSI, and I co-manage CPSI's medication safety portfolio. So far we've heard quite a lot of information on some very specific incidents. I'm going to shift the conversation for the next couple minutes to system-level trends that we at CPSI are starting to see at the global level. And I'm going to ground that information in a reporting and learning tool called Global Patient Safety Alerts, which is supported by the World Health Organization, and where we get that information. Global Patient Safety Alerts, it's an online database of international alerts, recommendations, advisories from contributing organizations around the world. It's growing like crazy. We're at about 1,400 alerts and over 7,000 recommendations from 26 organizations across the globe. It's evidence-informed, free to use. It's available on our website, and it works similar to a search engine where you can go and scan alerts, advisories, recommendations, whatever you're looking for by keyword, by specific topic. For this particular audience, I think medication safety is going to be a topic of interest. You could look at country if you're looking at specific country trends, or if you're interested in specific contributing organizations, that is available as well. So Global Patient Safety Alerts, we have contribution from organizations around the world. So we get bulletins, safety notices, rapid response reports, risk alerts, et cetera, from organizations in Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and across Canada as well. So it really acts as a global repository where we can take a look at global learning. You're able to scan and look at what other organizations are doing in their patient safety improvements. And then it really acts as a way to share cross-jurisdictionally. So one of the challenges with reporting and learning, as many of you know, is often the inability to share a lot of what we've learned, not only throughout Canada, but across borders, and this tool allows you to do that. So we do have a global audience. This slide just demonstrates that over the past year we've had visitors from around the globe. So if you're interested in contributing, you do get a global audience. So shift to the global trends that we're actually seeing in the database. So medications is one of the topic areas. It currently has over 500 alerts. It is the #1 alert topic for searches every single month and page views every single month. And it represents close to 40% of all the alerts that are put into the database and globally as well. So, and also the care management, surgery, medical device are the other chunks, but medications really do represent a significant amount of alerts, advisories, and recommendations that are submitted to us for global patient safety alerts. So what are some of those global trends? So listed here are the top 6 generalized trends. The #1 alert and advisory we seem to get institutes incidents where a wrong dose occurs or a wrong route of administration is provided. The second is just straight drug mix-ups, so the wrong drug flat out is administered. The third is drug interactions causing harm, and what we mostly see from this is just failure to check for drug allergies prior to administration. So a situation which is very much preventable with a simple check. Number 4, errors associated with packaging and labels, which we just heard from. Medication administration to the wrong patient, flat out wrong person. And then the 6th one, which I'm sure everyone is aware of, is just an incomplete or complete lack of medication reconciliation, which leads to the errors 1 through 5 above. Continuing on with the medication trends, so these are the actual drug classes that we're seeing globally. No real surprise in the list here, opioids being number 1, anticoagulants number 2, insulin number 3, issues with concentrated electrolytes number 4, and then chemotherapeutic agents as number 5. These are the drug classes most often associated with patient safety incidents and at that global scale and at that system level. And then as well, we look at the recommendations as well, and we categorize these recommendations just to get an idea of where certain areas need some work or where the recommendations kind of lie. And as you can see from the graph on the screen, almost 65% of recommendations related to medication incidents or are associated with rules, policies, and procedures. And when you compare that 65% to the 6% for training, we often see recommendations coming in that just simply recommend for more training, which is not always the most effective mode to institute change. So what do I mean by rules, policies, and procedures? So these are recommendations related to accessibility and existence of some sort of directive that's communicating technical information for assessing risk, mechanism for feedback on key processes, effective interventions developed after previous events, compliance with either organizational, provincial, or national policy, as well as incentives for compliance with some of these code standards and regulations. The second most frequent recommendation category within medication incidents is communication. Probably no surprise for everyone on the line. So issues related to simple communication, verbally, as well as flow of information within sites, between sites, and the availability of information as needed. This is often one that comes up where the proper fact-based evidence and information was just not available. As well as the importance of communication and use of in using medical equipment and application of policy and procedure developed as well. The third one, 13%, environment and equipment. So these are related to factors for use, location, and maintenance of equipment, and the general suitability of the equipment where it's located, as well as the possibility of a recovery after an error has occurred. And then finally, training at just 6%, which is issues related to routine job training, special training, continuing education, and an important factor that we see is timing of that training. So recommendations may concern the application of approved procedures in a site, the correct use of equipment, or the appropriate manipulation of protective barriers. So with that, I'll give you. I'll turn it back to Ambika. If you have any questions for me, please visit us, Global Patient Safety Alerts. If you're looking, please use the tool. It's free to use. If you're interested in getting involved and potentially submitting some of your own analyses, please reach out, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for that CPSI update. So now I would usually go through the ISMB Canada safety bulletins, both at the ISMB Canada website and our consumer-based safe medication use website. But in the interest of time, I do want to get some of these questions to our speakers, so I'll just direct everyone to our website, and I will just kind of skim through these slides. Mike, would you like to start the discussion?
Thanks, and particularly thanks to all our presenters. So we have time for a few questions, and a few of them have been sent to us. There are some in the chat box. The presenters, if you're comfortable, feel free to respond directly through the chat box if you're able to. But I'll address this one to our first group. Do your nurses feel comfortable doing the BPMH, and are your physicians or are whoever's using that information confident in the BPMHs produced by the nursing staff?
So thanks for that question, and we've spent considerable time with the training of our nursing staff because we do have pharmacy support at sometimes during the day to do BPMHs, but realized we don't have 24/7 pharmacy support, so the nurses had to bring their skills up to speed on completing a BPMH. We have done some work to enhance their skills. There's some training programs we put in place, and I think we're right now at a spot where you know, certainly we see a confidence level and we see good BPMHs coming from our nursing staff, but it did take time. And we also have a support system in place for them if they get into a situation where they have a very complex patients with numerous medications and lots of changes. They can contact the pharmacy who will come in and support and assist them with the BPMH completion.
Thanks for that. For our second group, it's certainly a very compelling and powerful story, and I was particularly interested in the family component. What advice might you give to other organizations who want to include the family in their incident analysis?
I think that our big learnings from this case is timely disclosure and really just being transparent.
That's sound advice indeed. I'll turn it over now to Ambika for a quick wrap-up.
Yeah, sorry we ran out of time a little at the end there. But we do want to hear from you. We want everyone to be part of the Med Safety Exchange, whether you have an incident analysis or a Med Safety initiative. Please email me. My email address is on the slide to share the learning. And also, don't forget to fill out, there's a poll that's now available on the right panel there. And the same questions will be available in the post survey at the end of the webinar, and they'll also be emailed to registrants. So whichever is most convenient for you, we really want to hear from you because this is part of our pilot run, and we want to make sure we're meeting your med safety needs and making the webinar most relevant to you. Any questions or comments or recommendations that weren't addressed in the discussion period, if you'd like to email them to me, I can forward them along to the appropriate speaker, and they can connect with you directly. I think our speakers are actually going to try to type some responses to you right now as well. So also, registration for next month's webinar is Wednesday, October 18th, is now open, so you can head over to the site and do so now because the next few weeks will fly by. Thank you again to all the speakers and everyone who participated and attended this webinar. I hope everyone learned something and can take something back to their practice site.